World War II saw some of the deadliest weapons ever unleashed, but also some of the strangest. From glove-mounted pistols to aircraft carriers made of ice and rocket-powered explosive barrels. These were the weapons, so bizarre they sound made up, but every single one of them was real. In the clandestine world of World War II espionage, where silence was golden and discretion could mean the difference between life and death, America's Office of Strategic Services, the forerunner to the CIA, found itself grappling with a singular challenge: how to arm its operatives for lethal encounters in the closest of quarters, where traditional firearms were impractical or too conspicuous. Out of this dilemma came one of the most peculiar weapons ever conceived, the glove gun. The Sedgley OSS was a one-shot .38 special pistol with a smoothbore barrel. This odd contraption was developed by the US Navy and the OSS during the height of the war. Its design was deceptively simple: a single-shot, .38 caliber pistol mounted to the back of a leather glove. The trigger mechanism was ingeniously concealed beneath a metal plate in the palm. To fire it, an operative needed only to form a fist and deliver a solid punch to the target. The impact of the punch would press the trigger mechanism against the enemy, discharging the weapon at point-blank range. It was a weapon not for gunfights or prolonged engagements, but for quick, silent kills, an assassin's tool in the purest sense. Its wearer could pass undetected, looking like nothing more than a labourer or a mechanic. There was no need to draw the weapon, no telltale silhouette under a coat, no metallic clink to betray its presence. In theory, it was a perfect last resort, ideal for missions behind enemy lines where conventional firearms might raise suspicion or be too cumbersome to carry. The glove gun was issued in small numbers and mostly remained a niche tool within the OSS. It was reportedly intended for use in sabotage missions and by operatives infiltrating in enemy-controlled territory. Yet for all its novelty, the glove gun was a weapon of very limited practicality. It could only fire once and required a very specific kind of proximity, grappling distance, for it to be effective. Reloading was not only slow, but almost certainly impossible in the heat of combat, and while its design offered surprise, it did so at the cost of power and versatility. There is little evidence the weapon ever saw use in the field, and it remains largely a footnote in a broader history of espionage warfare. In the early years of the Second World War, with German U-boats prowling the Atlantic and Allied supply lines under constant threat, bold ideas were not just encouraged, they were essential. From this climate of urgency and unorthodoxy emerged one of the most bizarre and imaginative military projects ever conceived. Project Habakkuk, a British-Canadian plan to build enormous aircraft carriers not from steel or aluminum, but from ice. The brainchild of eccentric British inventor Geoffrey Pyke, Project Habakkuk began as a solution to a pressing problem. The Allies needed air cover across a vast mid-Atlantic gap, a stretch of ocean too distant for land-based aircraft and too dangerous for slow-moving convoys. Traditional aircraft carriers were in short supply and required enormous resources to build. Pyke proposed something radically different, a floating airfield made of Pykrete, a strange new material consisting of ice reinforced with wood pulp. Stronger than regular ice, slow to melt, and surprisingly resilient, Pykrete could, in theory, allow for construction of colossal, unsinkable carriers that could be built in cold climates and repaired with little more than water and sawdust. The idea was so outlandish that it caught the attention of Lord Mountbatten, Chief of Combined Operations, and eventually Winston Churchill himself. Churchill, a man with a known taste for unconventional warfare, approved the project in 1943. A prototype was quickly constructed on Patricia Lake in the Canadian Rockies near Jasper, Alberta. This miniature Pykrete carrier, over 60 feet long, proved the concept sound. It floated, it resisted bullets, and it melted slowly even under the summer sun. Encouraged, plans were drawn for a full-size version, with walls 10 meters thick and 600 meters long, which is over 200 meters longer than the largest aircraft carrier ever built, the USS Enterprise. It would be powered by an internal refrigeration system and housing dozens of aircraft. It would be a fortress at sea, immune to torpedoes and capable of loitering in the Atlantic for months at a time. But as impressive as the dream was, the realities soon began to weigh it down. Logistical and engineering challenges mounted. The refrigeration system alone would require thousands of tons of steel, ironically the very material the project aimed to conserve. Constructing such a vessel would demand massive facilities in Arctic or subarctic regions, and coordination between British and Canadian teams stretched both nations' capabilities. Meanwhile, improvements in long-range aircraft and increased production of conventional carriers began to render the problems Habakkuk aimed to solve less urgent. By 1944, with Allied fortunes turning and the Atlantic increasingly under control, the project quietly melted into history. Never completed, never deployed. Today, only remnants of the prototype and a few recovered documents remain. In the final, frantic years of the Second World War, as the Third Reich theatered on the edge of collapse, with the Allies having complete air superiority and wreaking havoc on German industry, Germany turned to increasingly desperate and often fantastical technological experiments in the hopes of turning the tide. Among the strangest of these was the Windkannone, or Windkannon, a bizarre weapon that sought to use nothing more than compressed air to shoot down Allied aircraft. The concept, like many of Germany's late war innovations, bordered on science fiction. The Windkannone was essentially a large, fixed artillery piece consisting of a massive barrel up to 10 meters long, mounted on a reinforced concrete base. It functioned not with explosive shells or flak rounds, but by generating sudden and powerful bursts of compressed air. These blasts were intended to create a shockwave capable of damaging or destabilizing low-flying aircraft as they passed overhead. The weapon was developed under the auspices of the German military research program in Austria. Its operation was deceptively simple in principle. A chamber beneath the barrel was filled with a combustible mixture, often hydrogen and oxygen. When ignited, this mixture produced a violent explosion that forced air rapidly up the barrel, releasing a focused blast wave into the sky. It was, in essence, a giant airgun, one that aimed to disrupt aircraft flight using invisible force rather than shrapnel or bullets. The idea intrigued German engineers, and a prototype was constructed near Elbe River in 1944. Mounted on a concrete structure and aimed skyward, the Windkannone was tested repeatedly against unmanned drones and stationary targets. The weapon was reportedly capable of breaking wooden boards at a short range and disturbing light materials at a distance of up to about 200 meters. However, its effect on actual combat aircraft, let alone heavily armoured bombers, remained dubious. Despite claims that it could be used against enemy squadrons, the Windkannone suffered from significant limitations. Its range was extremely short and its accuracy highly questionable. It could only be aimed in fixed directions, and its effects diminished rapidly with distance. Moreover, by 1944, Allied bombers were flying at altitudes far beyond the effective reach of ground-based air cannon. The weapon also required a considerable amount of time to reload and recharge between blasts, making it utterly ineffective against large formations or fast-moving targets. No confirmed reports exist of the Windkannone ever bringing down an Allied aircraft. Like many of Germany's late war wonder weapons, it was more a product of desperation and imagination than battlefield practicality. The Reich's fate in miracle technologies, be it jet planes, flying bombs, or weapons like the Windkannon, reflected a regime grasping for salvation through science, while the reality on the ground crumbled around it. If you want to know more about the strange and secret weapons of World War II, check out the books in the description. And if you're enjoying the video, please give it a like, as it can really help my channel grow. And if you like odd or less known history, subscribe for more. Urban warfare became ubiquitous during World War II. From the shattered ruined streets of Stalingrad to the rubble-strewn streets of Berlin, soldiers are fighting at point-blank range, room to room, corner to corner. In this chaotic new battlefield, traditional weapons often proved inadequate. It was out of this grim necessity that one of the strangest firearms innovations of the war was born, the Krummlauf, or curved barrel. Developed in 1944 by the German arms manufacturer Rheinmetall, the Krummlauf was an experimental attachment for the Sturmgewehr 44, the world's first true assault rifle. The idea was radical, a curved barrel extension that allowed a soldier to fire around corners without exposing themselves to enemy fire. It was quite literally a rifle that bent the rules of conventional shooting. The device came in several variants, with barrel bends ranging from 30 to 90 degrees. It was paired with a periscope-style sighting device mounted on the top of the rifle, enabling the shooter to see what they were aiming at without stepping into view. One version, The 30-degree model was intended for infantry use, especially useful in clearing buildings or trench corners. Another was designed for use in armoured vehicles, allowing troops to fire from inside without exposing themselves. In theory, the Krummlauf offered a remarkable tactical advantage. A German soldier could remain behind cover, simply point the rifle around a corner and engage an enemy with relative safety. But the devil, as always, was in the engineering. The primary challenge was ballistics. Firing a bullet through a curved barrel caused enormous stress on both the weapon and the projectile. Bullets travelling through the bent extension would often shear, deform, or shatter entirely due to the sudden change in direction. The weapon suffered from rapid wear. The curved barrels had a short operational lifespan, often failing after just a few hundred rounds. Despite its flaws, the Krummlauf wasn't merely a paper fantasy. Several hundred were manufactured and reportedly issued in small numbers, primarily to tank crews on the Eastern Front. However, its operational use was limited and no accounts exist of having a major impact in any battle. Most soldiers found it unreliable or cumbersome for real combat use. Still, the idea captured the imagination of military designers and remains a curious milestone in firearms innovation. Today we are seeing the advent of drone warfare, but World War II also witnessed remote-controlled explosive devices. The Goliath tracked mine. Developed by Germany during World War II, the Goliath was an early foray into remotely controlled warfare, essentially a miniature motorized demolition vehicle designed to crawl into enemy lines and detonate itself in a violent explosion. Though small in stature, it represented a giant leap in battlefield automation and a chilling precursor to the age of unmanned weapons. This curious device resembled a tiny tank no larger than a child's wagon. At roughly 4 feet long and 2 feet wide, it ran on dual tracks and carried between 60 to 100 kilograms of high explosive in its hull. It was guided by a long, triple-stranded cable spooling out from the rear, through which a soldier could control its movement via a joystick-style remote. The concept was stark and simple. Steer the Goliath under a tank, into a bunker, or towards a concentration of enemy troops, and then trigger its detonation remotely. The weapon was developed in the early 1940s, and its inspiration reportedly came from a captured French prototype. The two primary versions were produced, an early model powered by electric motors, and a later, more reliable version using a small gasoline engine. Thousands were built over the course of the war, more than 7,000 units in total. But despite its numbers and futuristic premise, the Goliath proved to be more impressive in concept than in practice. On the battlefield, the Goliath encountered numerous problems. Its low ground clearance and limited power meant it struggled on rough terrain. The control cables, critical for guidance, were highly vulnerable to damage from small arms fire, shell fragments, or even simple entanglement. If the cable was severed, the machine became useless. Worse still, its armor was minimal. A well-placed bullet could disable it or trigger premature detonation. Nonetheless, the Goliath saw action on many fronts, from the Eastern Front to Normandy. German forces attempted to use it for a variety of roles, destroying tanks, clearing minefields, demolishing bridges, and breaking enemy fortifications. In urban warfare and against fixed targets, it occasionally achieves its intended effect. But in open combat, Allied troops quickly learned to spot and disable them, often shooting the cables or destroying the Goliaths before they reached their targets. Despite its operational shortcomings, the Goliath was a harbinger of things to come. It was one of the first true remote control weapons deployed in battle, and it laid conceptual groundwork for modern unmanned ground vehicles and drone warfare. While it failed to alter the outcome of World War II, it foreshadowed a new era in which machines would increasingly take on the dangerous task once reserved for soldiers. Among the many outlandish inventions devised by the British during World War II, none captured the imagination or the absurdity of wartime experimentation quite like the Great Panjandrum. Conceived in secrecy and cloaked in ambition, it was a massive rocket-propelled wheel of destruction, designed to thunder across beaches and smash through enemy defences with sheer explosive force. It was supposed to be the ultimate answer to Hitler's Atlantic Wall. The idea was born in 1943 when British planners were preparing for the inevitable invasion of German-occupied France. The D-Day landings would require breaching thick concrete defences, anti-tank walls, and other obstacles lining the coast. Traditional demolition methods were too slow or exposed troops to too much risk. Enter the Panjandrum, a name borrowed from a whimsical 18th century piece of nonsense literature, oddly fitting for what would become one of the most bizarre weapons of the war. The design was both simple and mad. Two enormous wooden wheels, each over 10 feet in diameter, were joined by a central drum packed with over a ton of explosives. Dozens of cordite rockets were strapped to the rims of each wheel, set to fire simultaneously and propel the contraption forward at terrifying speeds. Once launched, the Panjandrum was intended to roll straight up the beach, crash into German fortifications and explode with devastating force. Developed under the auspices of the British Armoury's Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development, a department known for its unconventional approach, the Panjandrum was built and tested on the quiet beaches of Devon, away from prying eyes. But secrecy could not hide its shortcomings. From the very first trial, the Panjandrum proved wildly unpredictable. The rockets fired unevenly, sending the massive wheels veering off course, spinning erratically or tipping over. Each test ended in chaos, with rockets misfiring, wheels collapsing and engineers diving for cover. On one infamous occasion, the device broke loose entirely, hurling back towards the test crew and a gathering of high-ranking officers. Miraculously, no one was injured. Attempts were made to stabilize the beast, adding steering cables, more rockets, even a third wheel for balance, but to no avail. The Panjandrum could not be tamed. It had all the force of a battering ram, but none of the control. In the end, the project was quietly abandoned. The Great Panjandrum never rolled onto the beaches of Normandy, and no variant was ever deployed in combat. Conventional explosives and engineering units ultimately breached the Atlantic Wall during D-Day, proving far more reliable than rocket-powered wheels.